So this last quarter has been a really interesting one for books. I found a sleeper hit that I didn't think I'd love as much as I did. We got another DNF for the year, which is a shame, and there was a whole lot of dragon riding fun. So let's go over the last handful of books that I read. First up, I finished Ascendant by Michael R. Miller. Now, this is a dragon riding fantasy, and I had a really good time with this book. It was really fun. It's very classic fantasy. It very leans in a lot of your favorite tropes. It feels very familiar in a lot of ways. One of the things I do hear people say is it is quite YA, which I half agree with. It is a wee bit youthful in its tone, but I think that really plays into kind of the very classic hero story setup. I think it works really well for this story. Ascendant is a coming-of-age story about a young boy called Holt Cook, who works in the kitchens with his father. However, when he finds out that dragons discard all the eggs that they think might be lesser or born with some sort of disability or problem of any kind, he takes it upon himself to hide and keep one of the eggs. And then we get the dragon, who turns out to be blind. And one of the things that really interested me with this book was the dragon lore. So Michael spends a lot of the middling section of this book really delving deep into sort of the lore behind dragons and a lot of how the magic works, and to do with these cores and this sort of very interesting mythology. Part of me doesn't want to tell you anything because that was a really fun part, was learning more about the dragons. It felt almost like a Sanderson magic system, which is just kind of the depth to it was really interesting. I like the characters. There was some really good side characters. There's one really interesting, bizarre character who's not human, and I'd really like to learn more about them. We do get a chapter in their point of view, so I'm hoping he's going to come up more in future books. I think that was a really interesting aspect to the story. This is a setup book, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I think it does a really good job of kind of setting down the foundations for a larger series, and it definitely has me interested to keep reading. And I know I'm holding up this book because the cover is stunning, but I did listen to this on audiobook. So I highly, highly recommend, if you like audiobooks, to check it out there. In fact, you'll find that most of my reads this month are audiobooks, mainly because it's a very heavy writing part of the year for me, and I'm doing a lot of edits, which kind of fries my brain with words, so audiobooks kind of help alleviate some of that, so I don't need to be looking at pages of words all day, every day. And from there, of course, we aren't done with dragons. We jump straight into Dragon Rider by Taran Matharu. Now, this was the book club pick for, I believe, August or September. I can no longer remember. However, I did jump into this immediately after Ascendant, and I do think that that partly played into why this felt like a very okay book. I think this isn't a bad book. I think it does a lot of what I enjoyed in Ascendant as well. However, I think I was rather burnt out because it's so similar to Ascendant in sort of the story structure side of it. And this follows Jai, a young boy who is a servant to the old emperor. So the emperor has passed it on to his son, and now he's kind of retired from emperoring. I don't think that's a word. Ruling! That's the word I'm looking for. So Jai looks after Leonid, which is the old emperor. However, what's really interesting is the dynamic between these two characters. So Leonid is actually a conqueror and took over huge countries in his day, and one of those was Jai's homeland. And Leonid actually killed Jai's father and took his son as a servant. So it makes for a bit of a weird dynamic between the two, because Jai kind of likes Leonid. There is sort of a Stockholm Syndrome-like setup here, and this is partly one of the things that kind of let me down with this book, is there was really interesting ideas that I feel like could have been executed on more. I really enjoyed the dynamic between these two, and I felt like we just didn't get enough of it. I mean, just that as a setup, I really would have liked to have got lots of long passages of them having sort of these tense discussions about different things, because Leonid really acts as a sort of mentor for Jai in the start of this story, which is really interesting. And of course, there is a larger political story behind all this, as there often is in this type of book, and I found that to be interesting enough. There were some interesting side characters. There is also this Griffin Guard, which are these soldiers with griffins, and we don't really get to see much of them at all, which was a wee bit disappointing. I know this is the first book in a series, but I felt like it started and it just didn't show a lot of what is really exciting about this story. I also found the start in particular to be very, very slow. Originally I thought we were going to have sort of a section where we have Jai growing up in the keep and such, but it was just a very, very long setup before the sort of inciting incident was probably 150 pages into the book. Now this, it looks quite long, but it's not particularly long. It's about 550 pages, so to take that long to try and get into the inciting incident and really catapult the story onward, it felt like a very drawn out start. I also found the tone to be quite strange. In parts it felt very youthful and very sort of classic fantasy, and then there's other parts that went really, really dark and it was obviously not youthful, and there was some really choice language, which again is not something that bothers me, but just when you set up a tone to be younger and then flip it on its head and have these darker scenes and a lot of swearing in it, it was quite jarring. I did enjoy the last third more than the first two. I think it was really exciting and it was a good ending, and it definitely kept me interested throughout. There were just a lot of things that didn't necessarily click with me, and I don't know again how much of that is because I just came off Ascendant and I was just kind of burnt out when they are very similar stories in a lot of ways. So I might be being a wee bit harsh with this book, I'm not sure. I still had a good time with it, but it didn't blow my socks off. Next on up, I also read Service Model by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now the setup to this story is really interesting. It follows a robot, an AI, that is looking after its master. This is until it accidentally kills its master. This is not a spoiler, this is done in the first chapter, and it kind of goes into this story about following this AI, this robot called Charles, and it trying to figure out what to do next because it's trying to work through its processes and its logs, and it can't do a lot of that when its master's dead, funnily enough. It has a very subtle humour that I really enjoyed. It is very silly in a lot of ways, and I really liked that. And also, as the story went on, it really started to get into deeper themes of humanity, and also a lot to do with AI and robots and how they're kind of set up in society, which was really, really interesting as we start to delve more and more into these deeper themes. However, I didn't really connect that much with the story because Charles and the plot are very meandering. And that's partly on purpose because it's meant to feel like that. That's how Charles is. He's meandering, or it is, because it's a robot. It doesn't really know what to do next, so it's kind of floundering, trying to figure things out. And I just felt like that made it really hard to get excited to pick up because we didn't necessarily see where we were going in the plot. And on top of that, because Charles is a robot and doesn't have a whole ton of personality, I will preface this with, it does have a personality, but it's just, again, very subtle. But that did mean that I wasn't desperate to pick it up and learn more about Charles, because it was so, bland is a bad word, but simple, we shall say. So I did DNF this maybe a third into this story. However, this might be one that I come back to. Again, it might be a timing thing, because it did so many things that I really enjoyed. This is not a bad book by any means. I think you need to be in a certain mood when you read it. And again, it's a super interesting premise and setup, and I really liked a lot of the humor in it. And the audiobook is narrated by Adrian Tchaikovsky himself, which was actually really, really good. He was fantastic as a narrator, so I would definitely read more of his stuff through audiobook if it's him narrating it. But I believe this is quite different from his other work. I don't think his other work is as humorous, so I really need to try more Adrian Tchaikovsky. But this one, again, it might be in a mood thing, I'm not 100% sure, but it just didn't really work for me. If you read it, let me know. Is it worth sticking with? Should I read the second 2/3? Next on up, I continued my Cosmere catch-up with Mistborn, A Secret History, which is a novella, and I put it in quotes because it is over 40,000 words. I think it's 44 something thousand words, which does technically put it over into novel territory. But probably for Sanderson, it is a novella. So I did read Mistborn Secret History. Now this, I won't talk about spoilers because it is very spoiler filled, but this is a sort of transitionary novella between the original trilogy and the second Mistborn trilogy. And it follows one of the behind-the-scenes players in the second era and going into the larger Cosmere as a whole. So it was filled with Cosmere connections and different characters that we have seen before, which was really cool. I enjoyed all the tie-ins and the references. I kind of knew the setup and what was going to happen in this book. However, I didn't realize a lot of the implications of this and how it worked into the larger story. You are supposed to read this after The Bands of Mourning, which I have read, and before The Lost Metal, which is the end of Era 2. So I'm now set up to finish Era 2. So I'll be picking this up very soon, and I'm really excited to see how Era 2 ends. That being said, this wasn't a 5-star read. I do think even for a novella, this had pacing issues. It felt a little bit disjointed, in particular the start. I would say the first quarter, maybe third, feels very drawn out, and I feel like it could have really done with being cut down. I can see why it's there, because it does fill in a lot of background information for what's going on in the original trilogy. But just as a reading experience, it was very slow-paced and disjointed as a story. It definitely got better as it went on. I think I'm probably stricter with novellas about pacing, because if it's a novella, you expect it to have a certain level of propelling you through this story because it is so short. If it's a huge chunker like Stormlight and it's over 1,000 pages long, I do not mind a slower section. You know, you're in it for the long haul. It's the journey. It's the journey before destination. But with novellas, I do think the pacing is really, really important. And I'm probably less forgiving because it is so short. And it doesn't necessarily have to be super fast-paced, but I just need it to be tightly paced. I don't want it to really fall off for a huge section before picking up, especially at the start when you're supposed to be really grabbed into the story. But love the Cosmere connections, super exciting, and I'm really interested to see where that goes. And I will be reading The Lost Metal probably this month. And last but most certainly not least, I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Now this is a chunky book. I think it's about 900 pages long, so it's quite a long one, and I wasn't planning on reading it. It wasn't on the TBR. However, I have been wanting to read this for a long time, and the lovely people over at Hardy's Books were running a read-along with it, where they did weekly videos kind of breaking down and talking about the chapters, which was really fun to tune into, as well as discussions on both my Discord and also over on Fable, which is an app I am not on. So I don't know much about it, but I think you can talk about books and things. So it's their fault. I decided to listen to it, and I knew I was going to like it, but I loved it way more than I thought I was going to. It's a bizarre sort of alternate history fantasy where magic was this huge thing in the past and it's kind of fallen off, and we follow Mr. Norrell, who's trying to bring magic back to England. However, Mr. Norrell is a bit of a strange character. He buys every single book about magic that he can find and kind of hoards it away from the world so they don't learn its secrets. And at the start of this story, he's very much the only practicing magician. And this is a really difficult book to talk about because it is so large and expansive. It very much feels like an alternate history, and you're reading about these people going through these different events in the world, and it's really, really cool. What I really enjoyed in particular was the atmosphere, and the really immersive writing really pulls you into the book. It makes you feel like you're living in this alternate history England. The magic system is very soft and very malleable. You don't really know, not really got lots of hard rules, which makes it really whimsical and interesting to follow. And I've really enjoyed kind of learning more about the magic and its history in the world, in particular with Mr. Norrell kind of talking about old magicians and old fairies and different creatures that used to roam or magicians used to make deals with. In particular, they talk a lot about this one old king called the Raven King, who was this really powerful magician who was English, and he created a lot of different really interesting magic, such as the King's Road, which is this huge network of roads through the world. So the level of depth is really interesting. Really getting into it's really cool. It does have footnotes. I know some people are very anti-footnotes, and I must say footnotes have been a mixed bag for me, and I do think that even in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, they can be a mixed bag. I think a lot of them do kind of whisk you off on this side adventure that doesn't necessarily directly tie into that scene, but then eventually a lot of them do come together in this larger story. So you can see why they're there once you finish the book, but a lot of the times at the time of reading it, you do feel like you're getting pulled out of a scene to be shown this other thing to kind of come back to it, which is weird, but I didn't ever feel necessarily that annoyed. I don't think I read a single footnote and went, I didn't enjoy that. I still had a good time even with these sort of side stories in the footnotes. I feel like I should be way more critical with this book. I feel like the pacing is really strange. Excuse the pun. Especially with the footnotes kind of pulling you out and sort of these very tangential chapters and side plots that some don't really ever tie in again, or if they do, it went over my head, which is distinctly possible, because this is a rather dense book in a lot of ways. I also am very much a character reader, and I do think I get really connected to a character or two, and that's enough to pull me through a story. Whereas in this, I did find Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell really interesting as characters, but a lot of the side characters could easily be blended into one another, and I forgot who a lot of their names are, even while reading it. I'm terrible with names in books. That is just something I suck at. But in particular, this one, there's a lot of side characters that I kind of needed contextual clues to remember who it was. There were some really interesting twists and turns in this story. Some I predicted, some were completely out of left field. And I do think that the plot wrapped up really nicely in this story as well. So I had a really good time with it overall. I do highly recommend it. Like I said, I feel like I should be more critical because it does lots of weird stuff, but the weird stuff worked. It worked really well for me. This is a really difficult book to recommend just because of that. I know this will be very much a Marmite hit or miss book for a lot of people. So I think that's kind of what I meant by what I said and rambled for about 5 minutes. And again, this was an audiobook listen, and I highly recommend the audiobook. The narrator is fantastic, a really, really good audiobook narrator. It does sound a little dated. I think it's quite an old audiobook. So if you listen to the sample and the audio quality is not necessarily super sharp and up to date, push through. It's worth still listening to. Once you get into it, you don't even realize that the audio quality is a little lesser than newer audiobooks. Just the narration. And in fact, I would say even the older sort of quality really leans into the story. It feels like it's kind of tied into the times. And the audiobook narrator did a terrific job. In fact, I think the novella is the only one that I read physically. Yeah. The rest of them I listened to on an audiobook. The only thing I read physically was Mistborn Secret History. And you might be wondering, Andrew, why is that? Well. The sequel to Harbinger of Justice is currently being edited, and I may have things to share, perhaps around November 1st. So if you have nothing else to do on that day, or even if you do have other things to do on that day, cancel them and set your notifications on. Also, buy my book and stuff. Perhaps I will have things to share around then. We shall see. Let me know in the comments below, what was the last book that you read? Thank you very much for watching. I think I got away with it, but I've got some numbing on a back tooth, and it's kind of made my speech out. So, I'm sorry if I sounded a bit weird in this. That's why.